Hello, Namaskar. This is Firstpost and you're watching Vantage with me, Palki Sharma. Our lead story tonight focuses on India's neighborhood. We've been telling you about the Maldives, about their embrace of China and its military. But while the world watched the Maldives, Chinese generals also made visits to Nepal and Sri Lanka. So what is the PLA trying to do? What does this military outreach in India's neighborhood mean? We'll tell you all about it. Meanwhile, here in India, a lot of buzz over the new citizenship law. What is the CAA and why is it controversial? The Home Minister has answered the question today. Will this settle the debate? We'll discuss. Back in China, a major developer is on the brink of collapse and Beijing cannot afford it. How Malaysia is winning the US-China chip war. Why Russia is going to polls if everyone knows what the result will be. Why Poland has fired 50 of its ambassadors from across the world. Why no one wants to host the Commonwealth Games. What the US was secretly talking to Iran about, what the world's first law on artificial intelligence says, and the inspiring story of a man who did not let his physical condition limit his ambition. Why it's important to build mental strength. All this and more coming up. The headlines first. North Korea's Kim Jong-un test drives a new tank. While overseeing military training exercises, Kim asks his soldiers to prepare for war. Last week, he had ordered heightened war readiness. The saber rattling comes as South Korea and the US wrap up joint military drills. In India, 2 poll commissioners chosen before the general election. They will fill the vacant spots in the 3-member poll panel. The opposition Congress party, which is part of the selection panel, gave a dissent note questioning the procedure. Spain's lower house of parliament passes a controversial Catalan amnesty bill. It seeks to end attempts to prosecute those involved in the 2017 secession bid. The separatists had demanded it. In return for helping Prime Minister Sanchez's coalition government, the bill will now go to the Senate for approval. Senegal's president calls for an amnesty law just days before the election. It will allow jailed opposition leaders to be released. President Macky Sall had postponed the February election. That decision had sparked clashes in the West African country. And turbulence continues for Boeing. An American Airlines Boeing 777 makes an emergency landing due to a mechanical problem. There were 249 people on board. This is the 6th safety incident involving a Boeing aircraft in the last 10 days. The British pioneered the policy of divide and rule, and the idea was quite simple. Create divisions within a community so they'll be busy fighting each other instead of fighting the British imperialists. And that's how they divided and ruled India. Now, decades later, China is trying the same. They've picked up Britain's playbook of divide and rule and they're using it in South Asia, offering inducements to India's partners and neighbors and building military alliances with them. Tonight, we'll tell you what China has been up to and whether India should be concerned. Our story begins with the Maldives. Earlier this month, they signed a defense pact with China. The Maldives signed a pact with China. They're getting arms and training from Beijing. And this came right after they asked Indian troops to leave. Indians, as you know, were stationed in Male for support and training. Their president, Mohammad Muizzu, asked them to leave. He asked the Indians to leave, and he's getting the Chinese in their place. In other words, India out, China in. That's what the Maldives is doing. And Beijing dispatched its generals to seal this transition. But their mission was not limited to Male. It turns out that Male was just their first stop. The PLA had a much bigger target in mind. After the Maldives, they traveled to 2 more countries, Sri Lanka and Nepal. We're talking about a top Chinese military delegation here. It went to the Maldives, Sri Lanka and Nepal. And this was a well-planned mission. So what was Beijing trying to do here? They released a statement, but it doesn't say very much. It says the PLA exchanged views with these countries on military relations and regional security issues. That's what Beijing says. We also have some reports from Sri Lanka and Nepal. They do not give us a full story, but they do shed some light. In Sri Lanka, a meeting was held on the 7th of March between Chinese and Lankan military leaders. This is according to the Lankan Defence Ministry. It says Beijing and Colombo are looking, and I'm quoting, are looking at more joint initiatives with a focus on maritime security. In fact, I have the Sri Lankan statement with me. It says, and I quote, the meeting provided a platform to explore avenues for joint initiatives on enhancing maritime security collaborations on mutual ground. Is this something that India should worry about? Well, there's good reason to be wary, because this statement is an indication of intent from both China and Sri Lanka. They want their militaries to work together closely. Plus, China is giving Sri Lanka military equipment. The latest transfer happened yesterday. Beijing gave Sri Lanka a stock of military equipment, stuff that can be used to defuse bombs. China just gave this equipment to Sri Lanka for free. This is part of a military grant. Beijing is trying similar tactics in Nepal. In Kathmandu, the PLA's team met several officials, including Nepal's army chief. Now, reports from the local press say that China is wooing Nepal with military gear. They're offering armored personnel carriers. They're also willing to install an ammunition plant for Nepal's army. Plus, they're pushing for joint military exercises between Nepal and China. And China also wants to train officers from Nepal's army. So there's a lot on the plate. We do not know about the terms and conditions. China's deals are usually opaque, but their pitch to Sri Lanka and Nepal is quite similar to the deal that they've struck with the Maldives. Look at the commitments they've made to Mali: free military assistance, weapon transfers, and close cooperation. And they want to do the same with the rest of India's neighbors, assuming that those deals are not already in place. And in each case, while the specifics may vary, China's overarching strategy is consistent. It's the policy of divide and rule, divide the South Asian region, pit traditional friends against each other, and advance your own geopolitical interests. New Delhi has a new challenge on its hands, and it must find a way to counter China's nefarious designs. Now to the big story from India, the Citizenship Amendment Act, or the CAA. It's many things at the same time: a political promise, a new hope for persecuted migrants, a long-pending demand, and a controversial law. It was passed back in December 2019. You may remember what happened next: a lot of protests and criticism, so the government put it on the back burner. But now it's back. The government of India has notified the rules for the CAA, basically how the law will be implemented. That's what they've come up with. Now, the CAA applies to six religious groups rather: Hindus, Sikhs, Jains, Parsis, Christians, and Buddhists. And these people must belong to any of these three countries: Pakistan, Bangladesh, Afghanistan. So if you fit this bill, if you're from one of these three countries and follow one of these religions, then your citizenship to India will be fast-tracked. That is the law. Now, a couple of questions. One, why was this bill necessary? The government of India says to protect religious minorities in these countries: Pakistan, Bangladesh, Afghanistan. Religious minorities face persecution here in a lot of cases. Thousands of them have already fled to India. The idea is to give them a new life. Question number two, why are Muslims not part of this list? And that's been the biggest question, really, of the critics. Rights organizations are asking it, opposition parties are asking it, even Indian Muslims are asking it. So now the Home Minister of India has answered this question. Listen to this.
मुस्लिम आबादी के लिए ही वो हिस्सा आज भारत का भाग नहीं है। वो भूमि इसीलिए दे दी गई थी। फिर तो हर देश से अव्यवस्था से जो आना चाहिए, इसके लिए भारत के दरवाजे खोल लो। भारत कहाँ बचता है? अखंड भारत के जो लोग हिस्सा थे और जिन पर धार्मिक प्रताड़ना हुई है, उसको शरण देना मैं मानता हूं हमारी नैतिक जिम्मेदारी है और हमारी कॉन्स्टिट्यूशनल रिस्पांसिबिलिटी।
But the debate will not end with this. The CAA has already been challenged in the Supreme Court of India. Some 200 petitions are pending. They say you cannot use religion to give citizenship. It violates the constitution. That's what the critics say. Plus, opposition parties do not like it. Some say they won't implement this law, like in the states of Kerala and West Bengal. So let's take a closer look at the technicalities. Let's understand what this buzz is about, what the controversy is about. What has changed between 2019 and now? Will this affect Indian minorities? And can states really refuse to implement a law? Now, the CAA requires a migrant to prove a few things, like your country of origin, your religion, your date of entry into India, and your knowledge of an Indian language. But how will this information be verified? Through documents. Earlier, you had to produce very specific papers. You had to come up with a valid passport or an Indian residential permit. But now that's gone. You can produce any identity document or certificate, maybe a school certificate or a birth certificate or a license, and this can also be used to determine your religion. So simply put, the threshold has been relaxed. It's now easier to prove that you're a migrant. Now we come to the date of entry. The CAA has a cutoff date, December 31st, 2014. You must have entered India before this date for you to qualify. Only then can you seek citizenship via the CAA, 31st December 2014. But how will that date be determined? Earlier, you needed a visa plus other specific documents. But now it's been expanded. You can produce a variety of documents like a letter from court or a government office, a tenancy agreement, any document from a public sector bank, certificates from a local lawmaker, utility bills, even a marriage certificate. Any of this can prove your date of entry into India. Again, the idea is to lower the threshold to make it easier for people to get Indian citizenship. So can state governments refuse to implement this? Well, maybe not. Citizenship applications usually go to the district collector. And who does the collector report to? The state government. So technically, states should or could have refused it. But the CAA rules call for a new body, a body that will report to the central government. Only they can receive and approve the citizenship requests. So expect a battle ahead. And now we come to the final question. Will this affect Indian minorities? The opposition says it will. They say the CAA will strip Indian Muslims of their citizenship. On what basis do they say this? What is their logic? For that, we'll have to go back to 2019. Back then, the CAA was never discussed alone. Another policy tagged along with it, and that was the NRC, the National Register of Citizens. And it's exactly what it sounds like, a list of all Indian citizens, a register. Those who do not feature on this list would eventually be deported. That was the idea. And the government said the NRC exercise would follow the CAA. So critics called it a ploy. First, give citizenship to non-Muslim migrants and then expel the Muslims. But now the equation seems to have changed. Home Minister Amit Shah was asked about this and he says there is no NRC now. He also said that no minority should fear the CAA rules.
असम में जो एनआरसी की ऑर्डर हुए वो सुप्रीम कोर्ट ऑफ इंडिया की, इसका सीए से कोई लेन देन नहीं है। आसाम नहीं, देश के हर हिस्से में सीए लागू होगा। इस देश के अल्पसंख्यक माइनॉरिटीज या तो किसी और व्यक्ति को डरने की जरूरत नहीं है, क्योंकि सीए में किसी की नागरिकता लेने का प्रावधान ही नहीं है।
So what next? We're probably just weeks away from the election, so CAA will feature heavily in it. Expect both sides to rake it up. As for the law itself, there's no closure yet. We have legal challenges pending. We also have a federal standoff in the offing. So this is a story that is far from over. In China, the crisis in the property sector is also far from over. A new developer faces the risk of collapse. It's called Vantage. It's a major player in the real estate sector in China, and it's been sinking. Unable to pay its debt, the company owes some 34 billion yuan, that's almost $5 billion US dollars, and this debt must be repaid before June 2025, before June next year. But Vanke may not be able to do that. They may not have the cash to do it. So now Beijing is stepping in, extending support and propping up the company, which has taken many observers by surprise because in the past, China has let big developers fail. Since 2020, more than 50 developers in China have either defaulted or failed to make any debt payments, 50. Just last year, 10 Chinese developers missed debt payments. And in all these cases, Beijing just stood by and watched. But Vanke has been lucky. China has made arrangements to rescue it. It has issued orders to 12 banks. They've been instructed to provide financing to Vanke. The question is why? Why is this developer getting special treatment? Because it's not just about the developer anymore, it's also about China's economy. If Vanke too is allowed to fail, it will break the economy. Because this is China's second largest developer we are talking about. It started some 40 years ago by this man, Wang Xi. Now, Wang Xi is a leading figure in Chinese real estate. He is often called the godfather of the industry in China, and he is believed to be close to the state. In 2017, Vanke faced a hostile takeover bid. Guess who stepped up to rescue it? The government of Shanghai. They bought shares in Vanke, and they helped Wang Xi survive. Even today, Shanghai owns around a quarter of Vanke, making it the company's largest shareholder. These shares are owned by the Shenzhen Metro Group, which is a state-owned firm. So the new bailout should not come as a surprise. But there's more to this relationship. China needs Vanke as much as the company needs the state because China's economy is struggling, and they're betting on real estate to revive it. Earlier this month, the Chinese premier made some promises. Listen to this.
We need to optimize real estate policies, promote the stable and healthy development of the real estate market, coordinate the resolution of local debt risks, and stable development.
Vanke is instrumental to this plan. So far, this company has been able to weather the storm that engulfed China's real estate sector. When others were defaulting, Vanke was still ripe for investment. But towards the end of 2023, the company's fortunes changed. There was a drastic drop in sales. Last year, sales dropped by 10%. This year, the numbers have worsened. January saw a decline of 32%, which caused panic among Vanke investors. Since November 2023, their shares have lost close to 30% in value, and this panic spread to the creditors too. There were murmurs of a cash crunch. Reports like this one surfaced. It said Vanke is speaking to its creditors. It wants an extension on some debts. And this week, the crisis intensified when Moody's downgraded Vanke. It classified the company's debt as junk. That's how Vanke got into this mess. China may be betting on its revival, but this crisis has highlighted a fundamental problem with China and its real estate sector. The problem is that there is no demand for real estate. The market doesn't have enough buyers, and that's a big problem for companies like Vanke because real estate developers need a steady flow of cash to survive. They need to sell homes in order to keep building more. But that's not happening. There simply isn't enough cash coming in, so the company cannot finish its projects. Vanke has contract liabilities worth 408 billion yuan, which is around $56 billion. And what are contract liabilities? It's mostly money deposited by home buyers to buy an apartment, for instance, the money that you give a builder. But chances are this apartment is yet to be finished. It's not ready. So the home buyer's money is stuck. In the past, China would leave them in the lurch, but it can no longer afford to do so.
On the supply side, it is necessary to reform and improve the basic systems for development, financing, and sale of commercial property. The sale of existing houses should be promoted in a forceful and orderly way.
Well, that's how desperate China is. It wants to revive home sales, even if that means deploying what it calls forceful measures. The last thing China can afford is another failed developer. Our next story is about the global chip war. We've been telling you about it, about how chips are now a strategic asset and how countries want to control supply and production. And by countries, we mostly mean the US and China. They want the control. Basically, the US wants to cut China off from the chip industry. So it's been putting restrictions on Beijing. And this, of course, impacts China. But it also affects global chip manufacturers, the companies. It affects them too. So they have to look for alternatives. And a number of countries are vying to be that alternative. Vietnam, Thailand, even India, all of them have thrown their hat in the ring. But guess who is winning this chip war? Not America, not China, Vietnam, Thailand, or India. As of today, it's Malaysia. An old player in the chip-making game, though not talked about so much. Malaysia is fast becoming a favored destination for chip manufacturing. Companies are pouring in billions of dollars. Intel, for instance, is planning to invest $7 billion in Malaysia. German chip maker Infineon is bringing in another 7. NVIDIA, the company at the forefront of artificial intelligence chips, will spend $4.3 billion in Malaysia. There are other firms as well. Austria's AT&S, Texas Instruments, Ericsson, Germany's Bosch, America's Lam Research. All these firms are investing in Malaysia. They're pouring money into 3 regions in particular. Penang, known on the tourist circuit for its beaches, and the nearby states of Kedah and Perak. Now, these areas are drawing in the who's who of chip makers. The obvious question, I guess, is why? Why has Malaysia become the go-to destination for semiconductor investment? Well, because it has a head start. The chip war may be making waves now, but Malaysia has been a chip-making hub for more than half a century. Yes, that long. Intel set up its first overseas factory in 1972, and this factory was in Penang. Malaysia had courted the firm aggressively in the 1970s. It offered them a free trade zone, meaning tax breaks. Malaysian labor was also relatively cheap. The country is a former British colony, meaning an English-speaking workforce. And there was the convenience of a shipping port nearby. Now, all these factors won Intel over. The company agreed to set up shop in Penang. And that created a foothold for chip makers. 52 years later, Penang and its neighboring states have become a chip hub. Intel was followed by AMD, then Hitachi, then HP, Hewlett-Packard. All these companies have been investing in Malaysia for decades, making Penang one of the first Silicon Valleys of the East. But here's the catch. The first chip manufacturing jobs in Malaysia were not high-tech. It was bottom-rung assembly work, the back end of the chip-making supply chain. Malaysia was chosen for grunt work, and this has persisted for decades. Only now is Malaysia being considered for more advanced manufacturing. The new $7 billion investment by Intel, it is for advanced chip packaging, for something called 3D packaging. And this is something new for Malaysia. But the country was chosen because Intel already has a presence there. They worked in Malaysia for years, which is why it was preferred to, say, a Vietnam or a Thailand or even India. That's why Malaysia was picked. It's a classic case of first mover's advantage. Malaysia took a gamble in the 70s. They may not have guessed how big or how crucial chips would become. But they decided to bring in the foreign investment. And now, half a century later, Malaysia is reaping the rewards. But that's not all. There's another side to this as well. Apart from good foresight, this is also about shrewd politics. Because Malaysia is friendly with both the US and China, it champions something called active neutrality. So it's getting investments from both sides, the West and China. Mainland Chinese firms have been setting up plants in Penang. They're worried about further US sanctions, so entering joint ventures in Malaysia is a way for them to skirt restrictions. The US won't ban chips made in Malaysia. It already imports more than 20% of its chips from this country, more than its imports from Taiwan or Vietnam or anywhere else, 20% from Malaysia. So Chinese companies hope that if they make in Malaysia, they can get around American embargoes. And Malaysia is happy to play both sides, get investments from both rivals. The question is this sustainable? Or will this blow up in their faces? We'll have to wait and see. Now let's turn our attention to Russia. The country goes to polls tomorrow. Voting booths will be open from March 15 to 17th, and early voting has started in some regions and for Russians who are abroad. In all, more than 110 million Russians are eligible to vote to choose their next president. But let's face it, it will be Vladimir Putin. Putin has been in charge since 1999. He's eligible to rule until 2036 at least. So we have to wonder, what is the point of these elections? Why waste time and money on an obvious outcome? Well, it turns out there is a reason why Putin insists on elections. Our next report has the details.
It is necessary to reaffirm our unity and determination to move forward together. Each of your votes is valuable and significant. Therefore, I urge you to exercise your right to vote in the next 3 days.
Russian President Vladimir Putin sent out this message today. He is urging all eligible Russians to come out and vote from Friday till Sunday. Some booths are already open. Early voting is taking place for Russians in other parts of the world, like Syria, Serbia, and the annexed parts of Ukraine. Putin hopes this encourages the people back home to turn out as well. Now, you may be wondering, why would Putin want to hold elections? Why would he want any challenge to his rule? Well, is there really any challenge though? After all, Putin has ruled Russia since 1999. He was elected prime minister in August that year, and then he became acting president on the 31st of December, when former leader Boris Yeltsin resigned. Putin won the election held in the year 2000 and served till 2008. But then came a twist. His term limit was up. But Putin wasn't done. So he switched back to being prime minister. 4 years later, in 2012, Putin was president again. By then, the presidential term was increased from 4 to 6 years, thanks to some constitutional rewriting. That rewriting happened again in 2020. And Putin's term limits were reset again, meaning constitutionally, Putin can stay on as president till 2036. By then, who knows, there may be yet another rewrite. But all this song and dance begs the question, why does Putin do this? Why does he hold elections in the first place? After all, they are cumbersome, expensive events. The last Russian election in 2018 cost over 14 billion rubles. This time around, Russia has allocated 33 billion rubles from the federal budget. That's a lot of money for a country at war to spend on a pointless exercise. So then why is Putin holding this election? Well, the simple answer is legitimacy.
I'd like to emphasize that the only source of power in our country is the people. This key legal provision is enshrined in the Constitution. Its main meaning is that only you, citizens of Russia, determine the fate of the fatherland.
If the people have chosen, what right does anyone else have to demand a leader's ouster? Which is why elections are crucial. Of course, they don't need to be competitive. Putin has swept every election since 2000. His critics say that is because they are rigged. Putin has been accused of sidelining opposition or having them assassinated. The allegations have been made this time as well. Alexei Navalny is dead. Numerous contenders were disqualified. The three remaining candidates are all aligned with Putin and his policies. They've refused to criticize him at all, and they're expected to fetch a grand total of 13% of the vote, combined. So, Putin is likely to sweep these polls with over 85% of the vote share. Now, you can argue that Putin doesn't need to bother with this, that he will always be Russia's legitimate ruler no matter what the West or any outsider says. But Putin himself insists on the whole charade. So, no matter the cost, Russia will keep holding polls, irrespective of what the world thinks about them.
On this show, we've reported extensively on corporate layoffs. But tonight, we're talking about a diplomatic one. Poland has recalled 50 ambassadors in one go. 50. Even news noobs will say that's a lot. You don't recall 50 envoys randomly. It's a well-planned political move. The question is why? Poland's foreign ministry is not saying very much. They claim it will help in professional implementation of difficult tasks. Such a ChatGPT statement. But the real reason is this. All these ambassadors were appointed by Poland's previous government. So the new leadership does not trust them. It wants them out. Prime Minister Donald Tusk hinted at this. He says it's important to have a loyal team. Now, we do not know where these ambassadors were posted or who they are or who is replacing them. But this trend is not new. We can tell you that. Poland's previous government was right-wing. They ruled for 8 years until 2023. And that's when the current government, this government, took over. And this government is not right-wing. It's a pro-European regime. So after taking over, they have purged officials appointed by the former regime. We saw that in December too. The heads of Poland's state-run TV and radio channels were fired, all of them appointees of the previous government. Now, at its core, this is a domestic issue. It's a clash of two ideologies. But imagine seeing this from the outside. Imagine the confusion it leads to. And it's not just Poland. Most Western countries cannot decide on foreign policy, it seems. It depends on who's in power. In other words, there is no policy continuity. Let's look at some of the major players, starting with the United States. We have Joe Biden and Donald Trump. Biden wants a nuclear deal with Iran. Donald Trump does not want it. Biden wants to stay in the Paris Climate Accords. Trump does not want to. Biden wants to keep arming Ukraine. Trump is non-committal. Biden wants to invest more in NATO and European allies. Trump doesn't want to. These are major policy differences. It makes it tough for other countries to deal with America. Imagine you're sitting in Tehran. You're a member of the Iranian regime. You work hard to sign a nuclear deal with the US, but come November, Trump wins the White House again, and he decides to cancel the whole thing again. What does that make you? A fool for trusting the Americans. Same case in Britain. The ruling Conservatives oppose a ceasefire in Gaza, but the opposition Labour do not. They want a ceasefire. In France, it's the same story. President Macron is a big supporter of the European Union. His rival is not so much. Her name is Marine Le Pen. She wants to take France out of NATO's command structure, end military cooperation with Germany, and maintain distance with Europe. Canada is another example. Justin Trudeau has a clear anti-India policy tilt, but his opponent does not. He's promising to repair relations with India. Now, such contrasts are not limited to major players. Look at Slovakia, for example. Their last government was pro-Ukraine. They gave military aid worth $700 million. But the new prime minister has stopped it. He says not a single bullet will be given. Do you see the problem here? Elections changing domestic policy is understandable. But on foreign policy, you expect consistency. You expect predictability. If not, it is hard to build a partnership. Look at India, for example. The ruling party and the opposition have different outlooks, different ideologies. Their domestic policy is different. But on foreign policy, they seem to be on the same page. And that has helped India. The best example is our relationship with the United States. It started with a Congress government after the Cold War, and it reached its peak under the current BJP government. And that is continuity. Without that, geopolitics goes for a toss. Now on to West Asia, where the US and Iran are talking. Well, not directly. Reports suggest that the two sides held indirect talks in Oman. Secret talks. A lot was discussed, but the sticking point was the Houthis. Since October, the Houthis have attacked ships in the Red Sea. The US has tried everything, a global maritime force, direct strikes, bombing Yemen, whatever they could, but nothing has worked. The Houthi attacks continue. So now they're asking Tehran for help. The US wants Iran to rein in its proxies. Will it work? Our next report tells you.
What do you do when you face a problem? You try to deal with it. You ask for help. But what if the help here is your biggest foe? It's a catch-22 situation, and one that America is facing in West Asia. A report suggests that US officials were in Oman in January. Apparently, they held secret talks with Iran. The two sides can't see eye to eye, but they're meeting. Why? Because the US wants Iran to rein in the Houthis. It wants them to stop the attacks in the Red Sea. Of course, it's not a request it could make directly. The US and Iran are enemies. They haven't had direct talks in ages. These were indirect talks. On the US side was Brett McGurk, White House's top advisor for West Asia, and Abram Paley, the Iranian envoy. On Tehran's side, there was Ali Bagheri Kani, the country's deputy foreign minister. Oman acted as a mediator. This was the first such negotiation in 10 months, so there was a lot of ground to cover. The two sides discussed the Iranian nuclear program. The US raised concerns about it. They discussed the war in Asia, but the sticking point was the Houthis. Since October, the Houthis have attacked ships in the Red Sea. The US has hit back. It's responded with direct strikes, but nothing has deterred the Houthis. The attacks continue. Just 2 days ago, the Houthis fired missiles at a Liberian-flagged container ship. So Washington has now turned to Iran. It wants Tehran to rein in its proxies. Iran calls them the axis of resistance. There's the Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, and other armed groups in Iraq and Syria. Since October 7th, Iranian proxies have attacked US forces 170 times. But nothing has bothered Washington, much like the Houthis. They've attacked commercial ships. Trade has been disrupted. Supply chains are affected. And in a gloomy global economy, this spells more doom. And the US is just not ready for that. Can Iran really help? The Houthis do enjoy Iranian support, and US reports say Iranian Revolutionary Guards are embedded inside Yemen. But there are doubts over Iran's control over the group. Some reports suggest Iran has very little direct control. Others mentioned that the Houthis operate with some degree of autonomy. Even Iran says that the rebels that control northern Yemen operate independently. So the Houthis seem to be acting on their own. The US may have asked Iran for help, but no one knows how much they can actually help. However, these talks are a clear indication that US actions in the Red Sea haven't worked. They announced a global maritime force. They hit back at the Houthis. They launched strikes in Yemen. But nothing has deterred the Houthis. They are still striking ships. They've launched 99 attacks since October. These so-called secret talks happened in January, but nothing has changed since then in the high seas.
Hosting multinational events is considered prestigious, like the Olympics or the FIFA World Cup. One tournament can immortalize you, except the Commonwealth Games. They've become the kryptonite of sport. The next Commonwealth Games are in 2026, but there's still no host. Australia pulled out last year. They thought the Games would cost around $1.7 billion, but as preparations began, the budget ballooned. It was expected to reach $4 billion, the cost of the Games, $4 billion. So Australia said, no thanks. Since then, the 2026 edition is without a host and the organizers are getting desperate. They have now approached Malaysia. Reports say they're offering the country $120 million. In exchange, Malaysia must host the Games. The talks are in advanced stages, but Malaysia has not agreed yet. And what if they do not? What happens then? Maybe cancel the whole thing. The Commonwealth Games are a glitch in the current world. They were first organized in the 1930s. Back then, they were called the British Empire Games. The idea was to bring together Britain and its colonies, to show how united the empire was. Decades later, the name was changed. It became the Commonwealth Games in 1978. Around 70 countries participate today. They're all former colonies of Britain, and you can see why that's problematic. These countries are trying to move on from their colonial past, but the Commonwealth is tying them down, sort of like a rude reminder. Even financially, it makes no sense. In 2022, South Africa was supposed to host the Games. But at the last minute, they were removed. Why? Because they had no money. And that's when Britain stepped in. The city of Birmingham hosted the 2022 edition. Less than a year later, they declared bankruptcy. So most countries have got the message, the Commonwealth Games won't make you money. And there's a reason why. Two things make sporting events popular. One, big names or celebrity athletes. And two, intense competition. The Commonwealth Games do not have either. Just look at the 2022 edition. Top sprinters like Shericka Jackson and Andre de Grasse decided to skip. The organizers were quite angry about it. They said the athletes would regret the decision. Same with Usain Bolt, arguably the biggest draw at the recent Olympics. Guess how many Commonwealth Games he has attended? Just one. So top athletes tend to stay away, which means less crowd, fewer sponsors, and less media coverage. So to recap, the Games have historical stigma. There is little competition, no big names, and not much money to be made. So why is it still a thing? Because Britain persists with it. Let's go back to the last edition. When South Africa was removed as host, Buckingham Palace was worried. After all, 2022 was Queen Elizabeth's Platinum Jubilee. It was the 70th anniversary of her accession. So the palace did not want to be embarrassed, and reports say they reached out to the government, and that's how Birmingham stepped in. Now, a similar effort is underway. Malaysia is being offered $120 million to host the Games. It tells you how dire the situation is. But is there a way back? Well, a lot depends on India. We are the biggest economy in the Commonwealth, also the biggest market, so India's participation could be key. But New Delhi is not interested. And rightly so. Last year, the Sports Ministry decided to bid for a bigger prize, the 2036 Olympics. At that point, the government was asked about the Commonwealth Games. Would India be interested in hosting one? The answer was a resounding no. As we see it, there are just two ways forward for the Commonwealth Games. One is to downsize it, forget the 280 events, forget hosting 5,000 athletes, think about a more pocket-friendly competition. Or two, scrap the whole thing. And we say the second option is the better one. Yesterday was a historic day for the European Union. It has passed the EU AI Act, the European Union Artificial Intelligence Act, a comprehensive framework to deal with the risks of artificial intelligence. It's the first for the bloc and a first for the world too. Europe says it will enable innovation while safeguarding fundamental rights. It aims to make tech more human-centric. So what does this new law say? How will it deal with tools like ChatGPT? Does it tackle deep fakes? What are the punishments? And will other countries follow suit? Our next report tells you all about the world's first AI law.
I think today is again an historic day on our long path towards regulation of AI. We are finally approving from the Parliament side the AI Act.
It's called the EU AI Act, a comprehensive artificial intelligence law. Basically, frameworks to control AI.
And it is adopted. Congratulations on this seminal work.
It's a first for the European Union and a first for the world. It's been endorsed by the EU Parliament. Now it just needs a formal approval of EU states. The Act has a simple principle. It wants to make technology human-centric. So the idea is to regulate AI based on its capacity to harm society. The higher the risk, the stricter the rules. First, let's tell you how the Act defines artificial intelligence. A basic definition of AI is computers that do tasks and solve problems like humans. But this Act takes a more detailed approach. It defines it as a machine-based system designed to operate with varying levels of autonomy. That's a lot of tech jargon, but basically it refers to the same things. That also includes chatbots like ChatGPT and Gemini. So how does the bill tackle risks posed by AI systems? The Act ranks AI systems. They can be low risk, mid risk, or high risk. High risk systems include those deployed in banking, schools, or critical infrastructure. They have to be accurate. A human must be overlooking them. Plus, their usage has to be monitored. If they directly affect citizens, they have the right to question these systems. Then there are systems that are prohibited. These are AI systems that can cause harm. They can affect the lives of people. For example, a social scoring system. Basically, systems that classify people based on social behavior or personality. China has one. But it is a strict no for the European Union. Which brings us to systems that are exempted. Not all AI tools come under this Act. For example, AI tools designed for military, defense, or national security. Those designed for science and research are also exempted. Facial recognition tools are allowed, but only for law enforcement. What about deep fakes? The Act aims to tackle that. If content is artificially generated or altered, it needs to be labeled. People, companies, bodies need to flag it. Then there's generative AI. It's the type of artificial intelligence that can create content. Text, imagery, audio, pretty much anything. The likes of ChatGPT and DALL-E. The EU says they must meet specific requirements. They must cooperate with copyright law. They must publish the data they are using to train these systems. Everything must be transparent. What happens if the Act is not followed? There are fines. They range from 7.5 million euros to 35 million euros. There are fines for giving incorrect information to regulators, breaching provisions of the Act, and developing or deploying banned tools. So how have tech companies reacted? It's been a mixed response. Tech companies have welcomed it, but they remain wary about the specifics. The Act will become a law around May. They will then have around 2 years, as implementation will begin from 2025 only. So companies still have time. While the EU is a trendsetter when it comes to this AI Act, the US mandates AI developers to share data with the government. China has also introduced a patchwork of AI laws. As we realize the dangers of AI, other countries now might follow suit.
The year was 1952. The US saw its single largest outbreak of polio. This was 3 years before the preventive vaccine, the polio vaccine, was developed. 58,000 cases were recorded in America. Of those, 21,000 people were left with a disability. Among them was a 6-year-old boy, Paul Alexander. When he became ill, doctors operated on him and saved his life. But polio is a difficult foe. It is a virus that kills by suffocation. It damages communication between the nervous system and muscles. And in many cases, this is followed by paralysis. So muscles that help someone breathe, for instance, no longer work. And this is exactly what happened to Alexander. He was alive, but polio meant that his body could no longer breathe on its own. So doctors came up with an answer: an iron lung. Like most polio survivors at the time, he was placed inside an iron lung. This is a metal cylinder. It enclosed his body up to his neck and allowed him to breathe. And here's how it works. It rhythmically changes air pressure in the chamber. It sucks air out of the cylinder, forces the patient's lungs to expand, so they take in the oxygen. Then air is let back into the cylinder, and the same process is reversed. The lungs deflate and you breathe out. So Alexander could breathe again. But there was a catch. Like most polio survivors inside an iron lung, Alexander was not expected to survive for long, but he defied expectations.
The iron lung is home to me now. It's my friend and it's my enemy. In the end, it keeps me alive.
For nearly 70 years, Alexander lived inside that machine, and this week he died at the age of 78. But why are we talking about him? For one simple reason: Alexander did not let his iron lung become an iron cage. In other words, he did not let his condition limit his ambitions. For starters, he had a learning mindset. He adapted to the iron lung. He learned breathing techniques, which allowed him to leave the machine for a few hours at a time.
Many people would go crazy in it. And I watched them do it in the hospital. But you adapt and you learn to do what you need to do to accomplish your goals and your dreams with the help of the iron lung.
And accomplish he did. He graduated from high school. He was second in his class. Then he earned a law degree, practiced law for 3 decades, published a memoir, became an advocate for polio vaccination. He even made a world record. Advances in medicine made iron lungs obsolete by the 1960s. They were replaced by portable ventilators. But Alexander's chest muscles were too damaged to use them. So he stuck to the iron lung and eventually made a Guinness World Record for the longest time lived inside one. But maybe his biggest accomplishment was this: learning the ways of Gen Z. He set up a TikTok account this year, which made him an even bigger celebrity among the young. His videos garnered millions of likes. But whether through TikTok or by means of the life that he led, Alexander quietly proved one thing: that resilience is all about perspective. And I'm sure many would agree. The world's biggest athletes and leaders, the biggest achievers, they all know that life is a mental game. And mental toughness is trainable. Sure, everyone is born with a varying degree of it, but you can train yourself to be tougher. You can work on yourself. It also depends on your family life, of course, your education, your personal circumstances, but it's not a fixed quota. Mental toughness can be taught and learned, and gaining mental strength is one of the most important things that anyone can do. Or as Alexander once said, I knew if I was going to do anything with my life, it was going to have to be a mental thing. And now it's time for Vantage Shots, images that tell the story. SpaceX launched Starship today, but lost connection with its rocket after it fell back to the Earth. A wandering white shark is on a world tour. She's traveled more than 2,500 kilometers from the US West Coast to Mexico. And would you eat lab-grown beef rice? Researchers say it has the potential to replace farming cattle for meat. Also taking you back in history, on this day in 1990, Mikhail Gorbachev was elected president of the Soviet Union. His reforms led to the weakening state control over the country. In 1991, he resigned as president. The same day, the Soviet Union was dissolved. We are leaving you on that note. Thank you for watching. We'll see you tomorrow.
Major milestone is going to be a hot staging maneuver. Again, we're going to be doing that in just about 90 seconds. To do that, we're going to shut down.
Light, you'll be able to see that in the left bottom corner. Those are the ones that can gimbal. In other words, they...
They're here. Jump for now.
Thank you.